If you find value in the show, please share it and review it. If you want to support the show even further, you can leave a tip or set up recurring support via the links in the show notes or on the website. Thanks again for listening, sharing, and learning with me. Now, on to this week's show. Welcome. This is Talking to the Internet. It is my privilege and honor to have Jeff Veen with us today. Jeff is a design partner at True Ventures. He is the host of a design podcast on the Relay FM network called Presentable. He is formerly the founder of Typekit and Adaptive Path. He's been in design leadership at Google and Adobe, and he was a designer at Wired Magazine. So, Jeff, welcome to the show. Thanks so much.
Hey, Corey, thanks so much. It's great to be here.
So, you have an interesting past, right? You have an interesting path, I would say, and not interesting in a good or a bad way, but it's different than some of the folks that we've had on the show up until this point. So, can you tell us kind of how you got into talking to the internet? What's your story?
Sure. Well, we'll have to go way back because I started on all this internet stuff, perhaps even before some of your listeners may have been born. I was just incredibly fortunate to be what I felt like at the right place at the right time. I studied in college. I studied journalism. I was always very into computers and being online and things like that. Going back before the internet into the world of like bulletin boards and modems and way back. And I felt like those two things, that technology and publishing, kind of came together in the early and mid 1990s, right when I was sort of leaving college and entering my career, to just afford opportunity that was, just amazing to me. So kind of going back, early 90s, I got out of college. I was working as a journalist. I had studied journalism in college. I was working at a newspaper in Santa Barbara. And I found a copy of this. I remember this. Yeah, actually, I went to a party and found this copy of this magazine that I had never seen before called Wired. And it was the first ever. It's issue 1. And I remember thinking like, oh my God, there's other people on the internet? Like people are talking about this stuff? Like I felt, I knew that there were people on, I was online and stuff like this. It's probably 1993. But it was nowhere in culture. It was this weird fringe thing, There was barely a web browser, web browsers had just come out, stuff like that. And so I sent this magazine an email because they had an email published in their masthead, and I was like, "Well, I'm a journalist and I know how to do stuff. Here's a link, a URL to my resume, which I had put on a web server, one of the few web servers that there were back then." Mm-hmm. And they wrote back saying, "You're the first person to ever do that. No one has sent us a link, to a resume on the web. So come on up here and let's have an interview." And that just led into this internship, which then led it to a job designing one of the first commercial websites called Hotwired, which was the kind of the digital version of Wired magazine back then. And that's how we kind of got started.
So I think you bring up a really interesting point about being creative about reaching out to people or putting yourself in front of people. Because similar story, like you sent the web URL, which kind of impressed people and like went, whoa, like what just happened? Well, I'm looking for a job coming out of college, and I ended up actually just randomly visiting a place that I thought it would be cool to work for. So it's like I was in the city at the time, and I was like, oh, this place is interesting, and it was an acoustics firm, right? And I was like, oh, I'm just gonna go see what's going on. I go there, they're having an ice cream social, right? It's like Friday, and they're having an ice cream social, and they were like, oh yeah, sure, come in, and it ends up leading into a job offer. So it's like, to the listeners out there, it's like if you're creative, there's a chance things could happen, right? Like as you're thinking about where you want to be or what you want to do, or there's a lot of different ways to do this. So that's a really cool point. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, no, I think there's just this notion. It's a trope, really, of like put yourself in a position to be lucky, right? Like luck is not just going to fall in your lap, and that has been kind of one of the kind of premises that I've run with all the time. The other one being that like the people who are doing what you want to do are just like you.
Yeah.
Which was, and even back then I was like, one of the reasons I sent a URL to my webpage is because I thought they were so far advanced. All these people working at this fancy magazine in the big city of San Francisco, like that they would laugh at me if I just sent a resume. So I better do this in a quote unquote wired way. And it turns out that they were just super impressed. And I got up there and met them, and I was terrified. And it turns out like, none of us know what we're doing. And they're just a little bit farther and have a little bit of backing and are, a little bit smarter. And so it just, I don't know. This is one of the things I try to teach my kids, like, hey, if you see somebody doing something that you think is cool, like ask them how they do it and see if you can do it too. And they're just like you. So we built this website in the 90s. It was one of the first websites that had advertising on it. I'm sorry about that. But, It was an attempt to legitimize this really fringe sort of quote unquote platform, and it really worked, and it was enormously successful. And I think to get to kind of the point of your podcast and our conversation here, one of the very important lessons that I learned there was that what we were learning about making websites was something that we never considered in any way proprietary. So we thought as soon as we learn how to do something on this weird new web thing, we should also publish what we've learned in addition to publishing everything else we publish. Because that'll just like, on one hand, on a more sort of kind of brand level almost, it'll kind of position us as experts a little bit. Like we're trying to figure this out. And if we share what we know, people will be like, oh, they know a lot. And then on the other hand, it'll just make the platform better. So we never considered what we were doing on the web competitive to other websites. We were competitive with things like television and print and, stuff like that. So we just got to make the web better, because then more people will come to the web and our audience will grow. So that kind of like, essentially, this is a little bit like the notion of open source. Everything we learn, we give back. Right. And then we all benefit. And then the tide rises for everybody.
So when do you think the switch happened? Right. Because that's very different in my mind than the internet we know now. So when did it shift roughly?
Well, I'm not entirely sure it's very different from what we know now. I think there are certainly places that are like never going to give back. We're going to hold all of our expertise in. But I still see, like, if you go to Stack Overflow, right, just an outpouring of people like, no, we're here to help. And, you can think of it as a kind of digital mentorship in some way. I figured something out, so let me, help the people who are following behind me in their careers at different stages of their careers. I also think, like, you go to Medium and just see people sharing and sharing and sharing, that in many ways it is a way of differentiating yourself from all the other people that want the same job you want, or, want that notoriety, or to be a quote unquote thought leader. So I think a lot of it isn't just altruistic, which is fine, right? A lot of it is really strategic as a way of advancing my career or making my company look more and more competent and capable, and building more trust with our audience and stuff like that. So,
and I think that's true with podcasting too, right? I can think of, I won't name them, but it's like I can think of probably 4 or 5 different outlets where, when I was trying to figure out how to do this thing, right, and I was trying to figure out what to even do or how to do it, there were very good resource guides or very good, equipment lists, or, this is how you structure a show kind of thing. So yeah, I guess that makes sense. Yeah.
The podcast's about podcasts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep. Okay, so we're at Wired, and where do you go from there?
Wired got acquired while I was there. They got bought by you remember the company Lycos?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was a search engine that was sort of competitive with Yahoo at the time. That didn't go well at all. That was a really interesting sort of learning experience for me, that this idea of like corporate merger or acquisition and things like that are generally only successful when the culture's either match or adapt to each other, and that didn't happen at all with Wired and Lycos. I left 9 months after that happened, as did a lot of people, and I went from there to actually one of the things I did. We then started a design agency, but that was a year later, and in that intervening year, I just did more of this sort of content creation, kind of the stuff we're talking about. I wrote a couple books. I spoke at a bunch of conferences. I really kind of invested in, I guess, what now today we would kind of call personal brand. And so from there, then it was much easier to get started kind of independently. To start an agency is what we decided to do. We called it Adaptive Path. It was a user experience agency. We did a lot of user research, information architecture, interaction design, things like that. This was concurrent with the dot-com bust, the sort of 2000, 2001 era, when all of the companies that were in the internet sector with their hugely overvalued valuations, their hugely overpriced valuations, all of that sort of crumbled, and so many of those companies shut down, and so much of the investment that had happened in building this new platform on the web felt like it was going away. And so we started this very small, there were 7 of us, company, agency, as an attempt to say, look, here's a path through, here's a way to fix your broken digital strategy and websites and things like that. Built on that same sort of open source knowledge sharing, really. Like, we did a bunch of publishing, a bunch of blog posts and things like that. We did a lot of speaking at conferences and doing our own workshops. We developed a methodology around how to improve the efficacy of products by doing user-centered design. And we took all of the content we made and made it as free as we possibly could, because we realized that the value was in, frankly, our performance of it, right? Like, people would read these books and reports and blog posts and see our talks and go like, that's what we want to do at this company. Can we have you come and help us do that? And the consulting was super lucrative, whereas the content we just gave away for free. So again, kind of the same model.
So how much was the design work supporting the way people talked on the internet? And when I say this, so when I think of talking on the internet, and I pretty much say this every show, so I'm sorry, but it's like, it's so broad, right? It doesn't have to just be talking into a microphone or blogging or, like, writing an article. I mean, you're helping internet-based companies design their user interface and design their user experience, right? Which is a form of talking to the internet, right? The way content is presented to me. So how do you see those connections there?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we did some really fundamental work helping organizations to develop a digital strategy for the first time. So, for example, we built an architecture and a navigation system for the entire archives of National Public Radio in the United States.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so all of those recordings had been digitized, but were all sitting on giant internal servers with a bunch of metadata, to get super technical, and none of it was accessible, and they didn't. And they had plans for how they wanted to roll that out, but we went in and sort of led a bunch of that work. So that's a really good example of taking a tremendous amount of content and just making it accessible. And the key is that word, making it accessible, right? Findable, discoverable, understandable, usable. In many ways, even a delightful experience for finding your way around so much content. So that was really kind of that first era of the internet, which was we are going to take the tremendous amount of content that has been generated for decades and try to bring that to this new platform in a way that anybody can access. We also did a bunch of work on what was called back then kind of Web 2.0. That was, again, in the early 2000s, 2002, 2005 era, roughly, where we started to learn how web apps were going to work. The web wasn't just going to be a series of hypertext documents, but instead could be really interactive and could in many ways replace a lot of the desktop apps that people had used, right? So you'd get things like Google Docs, or you get things like, instead of using Adobe Lightroom, you would use Flickr, and it would the kind of defining aspect of it was the ability to share with each other and comment on each other's sharing, and to use that sort of interconnected social graph as a way to discover things that were really interesting. Now, that is kind of the core of how the internet is working or not today, right? Mm-hmm. Which is this idea of like the people with whom I'm connected are the lens with which I view the world. And so we did a bunch of work with Flickr. We did a bunch of work with Blogger back then, as this core fundamental idea of the means for production of media are now democratized, right? That they are now in the hands of everybody. I think, in retrospect, that was a very important step to take. And now we have seen that our propensity to share and connect with each other can also manifest itself in abuse and deception. And those tools that we helped develop 15, 20 years ago are very powerful for both. And our society is sort of reflecting on that and dealing and grappling with that now. But at the time, it didn't exist at all. So yeah, that period of time, that Web 2.0 period of time, I think we've really kind of cut our teeth on how does this work at all? If anybody can put a photo online and millions of people can see it, or just to 10 people that they really want to see it, like, what does that mean and how do we do this?
Yeah, what were you using to communicate, right? So you're doing user experience design. So my assumption is you're doing things like A/B testing, right? Where you're showing two different forms of a site and you're trying to get feedback from real users on that. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I mean, user research is often sort of very broadly categorized in qualitative and quantitative, right? The quantitative side, the very sort of metrics-driven, lots of data tracking and an analysis and statistical analysis of that data is a very, very important thing. I did a lot of work on that with Google. We can talk about that in a little bit. But what we focused on in the first sort of decade of this was very, very qualitative, because there was already so much happening on the quantitative side, but very, very little on the qualitative side, which is the things like sociology, anthropology, psychology. How does that stuff apply to what we're doing with interfaces and the nuts and bolts of interaction design? So most of the work we did was around observing users as they used products and then trying to analyze what we saw and what we heard from them in their own language. So lots of usability testing, lots of what we called contextual inquiry, which is watching how people work and then trying to observe and see where they have problems in their work or their lives, for that matter, when they're trying to accomplish tasks. And then teasing out what the problems were and then trying to find solutions for those problems.
Yeah, that taps into my qualitative researcher brain from my PhD world. Yeah. So that's really interesting. That's cool.
Yeah. So a lot of that work, is how we sort of did some of that fundamental interaction design.
Wonderful. All right, so keep us going on your journey.
Yeah. So at Adaptive Path, one of the things that I learned pretty quickly was that I absolutely loved the work, but not so much the business model, I guess, is one way to put it, which is the consulting relationship and the constant need to be both in sales mode and in problem-solving mode, and the difficulty that you can find in the relationships with the organizations that bring you in. I just didn't. I realized what I was looking for is much deeper problem solving, a much deeper relationship with the users, and that I really wanted to get into product work and not just the kind of product consulting. That is, like, what is it like to spend a year or 2 years or 5 years on a problem rather than these 6 to 12 week engagements, which were kind of the standard at the time. And so I talked to the partners that I'd start the company with, and said, what if we did our own product? And this is really interesting because there was this consulting design agency called 37 Signals at the time, which made a product called Basecamp, which was really interesting. And they had made this product inside the consulting company. And then eventually they even stopped doing consulting entirely and just focused on Basecamp. But I said, what if we did a product inside of Adaptive Path? And so we kind of came to the conclusion that that would be a good idea, that we should try it. And the idea was to make an analytics platform, but specifically for social media of Web 2.0. That is, all the blogging tools that were out there had no mechanism to tell if the stuff you were blogging was effective or not. No analytics. Okay. No way to measure. All we had at the time, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but there were these little odometer-looking things, like little web counters, and people would stick them on their website so everybody could see how many hits they got to the web page.
Yeah,
right? So there was no science behind that, no idea. Like you could keep reloading the page and the number just kept going up, stuff like that. And it was public, like you couldn't. It was kind of the Stone Age of that kind of stuff. So we made this thing called Measure Map, which was this web app that you would integrate into your blogging platform. It would tell you how many unique visitors, like all the really basic stuff we have too, but in a very well-designed and accessible way. We launched it kind of very nascently and got immediately a bunch of attention from a bunch of companies that wanted to acquire us. They were like, nobody's done anything like this. Come work for us. And so that was a kind of a pivotal decision for the design agency. Should we send it off to be acquired? We decided we should. We took an offer from Google to do that. I left Adaptive Path at the time to go with the product over to Google. And when we got to Google, we took the core of that analytics, what we did, along with a bunch of people working on a big back-end system at Google. And so we took our front-end experience, put it on their back-end, and did about a year and a half of design work to make that scale and function, and that became Google Analytics.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, so that was a absolutely remarkable experience. It taught me a tremendous amount about scale that I hadn't understood before. Like the idea of I have an idea for how this app might work. What if every single website in the world used it tomorrow? I learned things like, what is 100,000 queries per second? How do you hold that in your mind when you're thinking about how a system is going to respond? Stuff like that. I remember getting to Google and somebody saying, if you need a copy of the web, you can have your own. Like, what? yeah, you can query it all you want. You can do analysis on it, but you can have a copy of the web if you want. And I'm like, oh, things are bigger here.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So that really helped.
We're not in Kansas anymore.
No, exactly. So I spent about 2.5, 3 years, I think it was, at Google, doing all that kind of stuff. We launched Google Analytics. I sort of then kind of moved into a position of managing and directing design for all of the Google apps. So that was, at the time, Blogger and Google Gmail and Calendar and all of those sort of things that now are the G Suite. Did a bunch of design work around that, and then realized the big company thing is not my jam. That I really enjoyed entrepreneurship, and so left Google after that to figure out what to do next.
Just to clarify, because one of the things that's ringing in my brain is when you say design.
Yeah.
Tell it to me in layman's terms. I mean, you've been doing this for a very, very long time, right? In layman's terms, is that location of buttons, layout of links? What is design in this space?
Oh, sure. There's a whole stack that we can talk about with what design really is. Ultimately, at the highest level, I think design is taking the capabilities of a system, a technical system, and exposing them to people in a way that they will find all those terms I used before, usable and delightful and intuitive and things like that. What I have found in the course of my career is that the more influence that the people who are designing the interface to the system have on how the back-end system works, the better the whole product will be. So in many ways, I mean, what are the features of this product? So when we were, for example, we're just talking about Google Analytics, when we sat down to figure out, what should Google Analytics be? I didn't sit there at the table saying, well, it should probably have some tabs at the top and probably some charts that look like this. We didn't get to that for a long time. What we had to figure out was, what do people really need to improve their websites?
You have to be familiar with Lean Startup. You have to be familiar with customer discovery, Steve Blank's stuff and Eric Ries and all that stuff. You have to be, don't you?
Well, I would say that a lot of the Lean Startup stuff is interpretations of the user experience stuff that we were doing 10 years before.
Interesting.
Yeah, so for sure, of course, understanding the needs, desires, wants, the tasks people have to do, you have to have a deep understanding of that, right? Before you can even begin to figure out how a system should respond and what the technology should be. You have to start from user needs, and so we called that UX design, user experience design. There are layers and layers of that. There are like the architecture, the information architecture of the system underneath, right? Before you ever get to an interface, like how is this, all the content or all the features, how is that all organized in a way that maps to the way people will expect it to work? Like that's a bunch of work, and it's super abstract, and there's lots of boxes with arrows pointing at them and stuff in your little diagrams for how everything's going to work. On top of that is what I've been calling interaction design. Like, what are all the mechanisms, right? Like, we have all this new interaction design that came with touchscreens and mobile. Like, should we use this? And every time there's a new version of our mobile operating systems, there's new little affordances that we can use for how we explain little bits and how it should work. And so that all seems really intuitive. And then on top of that, you have visual design, right? Like, what are things actually going to look like? What color are they? Like, at what rate do we round the corners of the buttons so that they, right? Like all of that level of detail bubbles up to then like the brand overall of the company that is making the thing, so that this feels like it comes from this company and resonates with all the brand values that the company has. So it's enormous, the scope of when I use the word design of what I'm really referring to.
And the funny thing about it too is like, I mean, I don't know anything about this other than maybe the one portion you talked about. So in my graduate school work, you know, I was part of teaching engineers how to be more entrepreneurial, right? So we used things like lean startup. We used things like customer discovery process and all that stuff. And our goal was basically just get them, you know, they're engineers. So they want to go feature. And our goal was saying, you know, hey, let's think about the 3 necessary features and not the 15 that you really want to put into this. And let's let the users tell us that, right? And then like, so that's an interesting component to me. And then the other interesting component to me is like, you talk about design, you talk about all the different layers of design. I could never actually develop all of those on my own, or like think about developing all of those on my own. But boy, I could tell you when somebody's done it like in a way that it doesn't resonate with me. It's like,
totally.
those buttons are too square. They just look weird. They look funny. I don't know what's wrong with them. I don't know that they just need this tweak or that tweak. Wow, So what you do on the day-to-day is really interesting. It's really fascinating from somebody who sits, you know, maybe a little bit more on the engineering side of things as opposed to the design side of things. That's really cool.
Yeah. There's a lot of sort of craft that goes into it, right? Like, how do you actually take this disparate set of features and synthesize them into a whole that is harmonious, right? And looks and feels great and intuitive and accessible. But then there's this whole other part of like, before anybody writes a single line of code, we have to be really, really sure that everything we're going to build is going to map to expectations that people have, right? That are actually going to fill the need that people have in their lives for what this thing does. And so that's why I find like, look, my whole career has been around fighting for designers, the people who think about this stuff, the people who are out there talking to users all the time, to have a seat at the table at the highest level in our organizations, at the highest level, like chief product officer, chief design officer, because the decisions that are happening up there about what the business the company should be in and how they should achieve their goals, what they should do and what they shouldn't do, the prioritization, where resources are allocated, all of that should come from, what do our users need? Who are they? What, right? How can we best satisfy them? Because else none of it's going to work. None of it will.
All right. So I hope I don't skip too far. Get us to starting Presentable, right? Joining Relay FM, getting the podcast up and going.
Sure. The quick jump forward was after I left Google, we started a company with one of the people I worked with at Adaptive Path called Typekit, which brought fonts to the web. That was a startup from scratch. We got venture capital funding. we built that out. It was really successful. It grew really, really rapidly, which was good because we learned how scale worked at Google, right? So we were able to scale that up. A few years later, we sold that to Adobe, and from there, I became vice president of design at Adobe, and led the transition of Adobe from its kind of box software model to the Creative Cloud.
Okay.
And using, again, all that user experience stuff, I did all of the design work that kind of sat on top of that transition. I stayed there for about 3 years. And again, came back to the conclusion, big company thing, not for me. And I got an offer from the venture capital firm that invested in Typekit to come be a partner. And I thought, well, wow, that's so different. I'd never even considered that before. To be an investor. And they said that we had become very good friends and very close with a number of them over the relationship of Typekit and the financing and the acquisition and all of that stuff. And we sort of worked out this thesis, this premise that actually the application of user experience principles that I have been promoting for 25 years now, when applied to a company at its absolute nascent very beginning, right? Literally 2 co-founders with a pitch deck ready to get started. Mm-hmm. We apply all this stuff that you and I have just been talking about for the past 20 minutes. We apply that to a brand new company, do a DNA transfer, and it reduces the risk and you get more return on your investment.
Oh yeah.
So that's right. So that's what we're working on. And now it's a very roundabout way of getting to why did I start a podcast. What I found while doing that work was that I needed to stay kind of abreast with what's happening in the user experience world without practicing it like I always had. Okay. Like I had been for 20 years or 25 years, been very up to date with what's happening in user experience because I was doing it every day. And now suddenly I wasn't. And I was like, well, how am I going to keep on top of this? Like read Medium posts all day or what? Yeah. So I was like, I know what I'll do. I will go find all the experts in the world on user experience and ask them if they talk to me for an hour. And I'll record it. And that will be both the discipline for me and an avenue for additional learning because I fundamentally believe in the growth mindset and that I should, every single day, there's more opportunity for learning. Mm-hmm. So that was my motivation, was to make sure I just stayed on top of what's happening in the world in a way that like set a deadline for me so I would actually do it.
Yeah. So the deadline of the weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever you end up finalizing on, right? That show is the necessary driver. How did you, I mean, you had clout, I would say. You had some, cachet in the industry, right? So my guess is an email from you looks a little bit different, but did you find yourself having trouble getting folks to come on the show?
No, not really.
Okay.
Yeah, it is entirely driven by my short attention span. Like, what should we learn about in this week? Let me go figure out who would be good and stuff like that. But yeah, after a bunch of years, decades, I've got a pretty good network. Like, that's another thing. Going back to the beginning of our conversation and just like asking people, is a good way to build up a bunch of relationships over the course of many, many years, where at this point in my career, I feel like, I have a good sense of if I want to reach out to somebody, I can find my way there through people I already know.
Yeah, that's good.
Do
people struggle with balancing things they can talk about and things they can't, or is it like you were describing before, where pretty much it's an open book and we're sharing stories about what's going on and how we're doing things as a way to edify the community?
Yeah, there's a real distinction between how we do things and what we're doing, and I am not as interested in what we're doing. Right? I'm much more interested in how do you do all the stuff you have to do. So I'm talking to the head of user research at Uber. Like, I don't really care if they're going into scooters or doing electric bikes or like none of that stuff matters. What I really want to know is like, how do you do your job every day to improve the rider and driver experience? And so getting people to talk about their technique, their philosophy and work, how they build their teams, how they how they have influence inside of organizations, like I've been talking about, that seat at the table. Like, I find that stuff endlessly satisfying. But like, whatever, I'll go look at Tech Meme for what, Uber or Apple are doing next.
Yeah.
That's, there's plenty of people that want to talk about the what and not the how.
Okay, so you get this idea that you want to stay in the industry, stay, current. Why a podcast? Like, why did that seem like the way to do it?
Especially for a journalism major. Why? Right? Why am I not like writing a weekly
newsletter?
Weekly newsletter. Yeah, the newsletters are crazy right now. Like, I should be doing that. I find writing so hard. Like, I feel like I have an aptitude for it. I feel like I'm pretty good at it. I started my career doing that. I wrote some books. They seem to be pretty well received. But it is very different going out and arranging like a time to interview somebody and then doing that. Like, I do every other week is a new episode. So I'm like, I got to find somebody next week. I got to do that. And I'm going to have a thing on my calendar that says, go talk to this person. And I have to, I better prepare for that. So I read a bunch, I probably do 4 or 5 hours of research before I talk to somebody. And I got to get all this work done because on Tuesday we're talking,
Yes.
And then I got to get it done because the advertisers, I'm very fortunate to have like hooked up with a network, the Relay FM network, phenomenal people but they're like, hey, I got to get 2 episodes per calendar month, or I can't invoice. And I'm like, well, I want you to I don't want to, affect their business.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah. I do it. Right. And that's so different from the kind of habit forming discipline of sitting down and writing and posting. I could probably find a way to make that work, but I realized that after years and years of struggle with that, I found it really painful. So I thought, let me try this podcasting thing. It feels like a way to achieve some of those goals, using a mechanism that might be just a little bit more fluid. So,
and how did you get connected with the Relay guys?
A friend of mine had a podcast on Relay. Yeah, a friend of mine, Merlin Mann.
Yeah, okay.
Go listen to all of his podcasts. He's fantastic. I think he's a professional podcaster now. I think that's what he does. He and I worked together at Adaptive Path. We hired him, 150 years ago, shortly after the First World War. It seems like it was way back when. And he and I worked on some projects on Adaptive Path, and we stayed connected again. There you go, right? The network. I reached out to him. I'm like, you podcast all the time. I want to do it. And he's like, oh, here, go talk to Mike and Steven. They're great. And he just introduced me to the guys at Relay, and I chatted with them, and they were like, this sounds fun. So let's do it.
Nice. Okay, so talk to us now a little bit more about how you make decisions related to Presentable, right? I mean, there's a whole world of people you could bring on the show. There's a whole world of topics. You said you wanted to stay current. You wanted to stay in the industry. How do you decide, okay, in 2 weeks I'm going to talk to so-and-so, or I'm going to reach out to this person, for an interview that's going to happen a month from now or a month and a half from now? Like, how do you make all those decisions, picking shows, planning shows, going from an idea to an actual published show? Those type of things. Well,
it is usually, again, driven by desire to understand how our industry, how our profession, how our craft are transforming over time, how they're evolving, how we're getting better at what we do. So I try to read pretty broadly on what's happening. Again, mostly, if you ask me for a publication, I probably couldn't give you one, but I do find my way through my social networks, through Twitter or Instagram or wherever I'm looking at the people that I respect in the industry, at what they're pointing to and reading, and I kind of look and see like, wow, all right, there's clearly a trend here and another trend here, and people are thinking about this. So how can I learn more about that? Well, let's break it down, right? So there is kind of in the zeitgeist right now, this idea that the user research methodologies that we developed over the past 20 years led to what I was referring to earlier with social media, right? We were so focused on making things for users that we created things that ended up being fairly destructive. And it was really almost impossible to anticipate that that would be destructive, right? But the work we did on social media mechanisms and kind of has led to this world where there's lots of, fake news and manipulative social media posting and stuff like that. So how do we solve for that now? And how do we do it without throwing away everything that we learned about how to make products more effective for people to use, right? Well, there's so much in there. I'm like super, super interested in that. So what direction do I want to take it? Let's think. Well, like we did a lot of discovery research early on. That's sort of like I was talking about contextual inquiry and anthropology and stuff like that. Why don't I talk to some people that do that all the time and say, how are those methods changing now based on what we're learning about how the world is and how the world is responding to digital products? Man, there's probably 50 people I could go find that would have strong opinions on that. So let me go start working the network and find people like, all right, great, anthropologists or ethnographers, people with that in their background, and what can we talk about there? Who can I talk to and stuff like that? There's a whole ethical part of this. Who's thinking about that? Who's approaching this from the more philosophical point of view? Let me go find some of those people. Line that up. So it kind of goes like that over and over again.
And how do you know when a topic is done? It's time to move on. Is it an active thing, or is it really just your interest to go someplace else, and next thing you know, you're in a different world?
Yeah, part of it is it gets a little less interesting over time. I'll give you a really good example. Google AMP pages.
Yes.
I don't know if you're familiar with that, right?
Yeah.
Like this is essentially an attempt to make the mobile web experience better by telling content providers to put all their content on Google servers instead. And there was a big debate over yes, we want the web to be better on mobile devices, but no, probably having all of our media, like everything from the New York Times to the Huffington Post to who knows what else, probably not a good idea to have all of that coming through one central big company.
Yeah.
Right? That's an interesting debate. And I did a couple of shows on that 3 years ago or something like that. And I think we kind of hashed it out and kind of figured out all right, there's probably stuff to learn from Google AMP, and there's probably too much power in one place and stuff. And I talked to some designers and technical people and things like that. I'm kind of less interested in that conversation today. I feel like as an industry, we all kind of got to a place that felt all right. I'm sure there's more to talk about there, but I'm less interested in it now than I was 3 years ago.
Yeah. You're having these conversations with, interesting people in the design space. If I'm a listener of your show, or if I'm somebody new to your show, right? What do you hope I take away from that show?
Well, there's, I think, a few different audiences for the show. And I probably have different takeaways for each. In three kind of broad categories, I try to speak to people who are leading design, people who have progressed in their career to the point where they are part of the decision-making of an organization and tend to have teams under them. I'm very interested in how to improve their influence in their organizations. Then I would say there's a whole range of individual contributors, right? The people who are practicing design every day. I focus a little bit less on how to get better at your craft and a little bit more on, do you have aspirations to be your boss, right? To have your boss's job, right? Again, that path of influence in design. And then I think there's a big, a broad sort of category of people who are just interested in design but don't practice it. So lots of developers and people in marketing and other, even business people that are like, this design thing keeps coming up. Can that improve my business? And so, and for them, it's more of a message of, look, let me model for you what good organizations do. organizations that are mature in their user experience design practice and their product development practice and user-centered needs. Let me model what that looks like for you so that you can start that journey within your organization and find the people who could sit at the leadership table. So for me, it's the whole goal of this is around empowerment, around how for this whole category, right? Like half of product development is design, right? As I define it broadly. Mm-hmm. For all of those people in an organization, which historically have been less powerful than people in technical positions. They have less budget, they have the fewer numbers of them in the organization, and much less influence. How do we empower those people to be more powerful in their organizations so that they can then affect the quality of the experiences we have with our digital products every day?
Okay. How do you measure success, right? Like how do you, in your, this is getting into the weeds, and I intentionally want to get into the weeds for a second. For you personally, you put out a show every 2 weeks, right? And how do you say, okay, this show is going well. This show is successful to me. I don't mean to the world, right? But like I am happy with what's happening right now. What's your mechanism there?
Yeah, well, it's not downloads. I don't care. don't really look at it. I know, but I also have the luxury of not caring about it because I am part of this network and they watch the numbers to make sure that they can sell ads against it. So if they're happy and advertisers are buying the slots, then I don't have to worry about that. I mean, there is some sense of a vanity metric of like, I wish more people would listen to it. But that's also a goal of having the ideas that my guests are espousing exposed to more people. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's fine. My goal is to become better informed at what is happening and changing in the world of design and product development. So it is entirely my own. Like if I feel excited to talk to the guests every couple weeks and I feel afterwards like that was a great conversation, I really enjoyed it, then the project is successful, right? So that's really, actually, let me give you another one too, because I have kind of another motivation around it as well. So one is honestly like, are good ideas getting exposed in the world again, in that like open source way that we've been talking about. The other part of it is also at this point in my career, I realize that a lot of the community that makes digital products is pretty homogeneous. That it is, we've seen this sort of shift and change, or if not change, at least be exposed in the last 5 or 7 years, which is that so much of the technology that exists in the world was designed, developed, built, conceived of by a small group of people, typically pretty well educated, typically pretty male, pretty white, and typically all based in Silicon Valley. Okay. So much of the experience that the entire world uses is made by that sort of, elite kind of 1% of the population, not in terms of their income, although that's also true, but in terms of who gets to be part of that process, right? And that, I think we have accurately exposed that feels unfair to our society, that our products are not good enough. Like when you make a social media product and it's entirely designed by people who have never been exposed to abuse before, then that's not a priority in how they make the decisions about the product. And we've seen that. We're like, what's much better is when you have a much more diverse and inclusive set of people involved in influencing the product. So what can we do with my little podcast to help that? I asked myself a bunch of years ago. And that is, as I'm like looking at the topics that I'm really interested in, that what we were talking about a few minutes ago. And I say that, look, there's like 20 people I could go talk to who would have strong opinions on that. Could I find the people whose voices have not been represented in the industry to be the voice of that idea? And that's more work, but I don't care because it's the point is to get those voices to be, to have the seat at the table, right? Mm-hmm, so instead of just going to, the obvious choices for thought leadership who have had a platform based on so much privilege, work a little harder and find a different a person who has not had that privilege. And it's a way of, again, exposure to the industry and to the people who are making decisions. So that's part of it too.
Yeah, that's great. All right. So pros and cons of your many years talking to the internet, good things that have happened, bad things that have happened, highlights, low points. What are all these things? Which ones pop up to your mind as I ask the question?
Well, yeah. I guess one of the things that I have, I don't know if struggle is the right word, but been very mindful of is that I spent the first 15 years of my career, let's just say from 1995 to 2010, I spent those years working so hard on building a personal brand because I realized the opportunity it would enable, right? Having written a book allowed me to get invitations to conferences where eventually I started to keynote those conferences, and that made it really easy to get clients so we could start a company, a design agency that would then had built-in marketing, had a built-in client base, right? That was all that work. It allowed me to very easily get introductions to venture capitalists so that I could start a company and finance that company because I had this history and I had been working on this brand. People knew who I was. That was really an important thing I felt like in my career over time. And I realized then when social media really became our identities, that I had been doing that for so long that my identity online was 100% professional. And I waited till later. I was 40 before I even had kids. So I waited later in life to be able to shift my priorities much more towards family and less about all the work. Mm-hmm. And I realized, I don't feel comfortable with sharing who I really am in this digital world. I'm not going to post pictures of my kids on Twitter because I have a lot of followers. I don't know who they are. And I realized a lot of those avenues feel closed. And I never developed the muscle of actually sharing with the people that I care about digitally, in a way that wasn't always just focused on advancing the brand and let me tell you about professionally and let's talk about the craft of design and entrepreneurialism and all of that. And so in many ways, if you go look at all my social media accounts, it's been years since I've posted really much of anything. Okay. And that's been this sort of retreat into all right, what do I really want? Certainly there's now much more room on the stage for other voices. I don't need to be out there doing that all the time. I still want to give back. And I don't know. That's probably one of the things where I have really stepped back.
Okay. What's one of the biggest highlights of, your years talking to the internet?
I feel like it has given me the opportunity to create things that have meaning behind them. But not just the things, but the act of the creation, to me, is one of the best things in the world. And what I mean by that is having a small group of insanely talented people who feel safe and vulnerable enough to be their most creative. When you get that chemistry right, that team right, it feels unstoppable. It feels like that notion of flow, right? We are right on the balance of mastery and failure, right on the balance between the two the whole time. And what I have seen people capable of when they are part of a team like that is absolutely remarkable. It's how I spend most of my time now trying to help our portfolio companies in our venture capital fund. How do we help them create that? What are the cultural practices and all of the leadership skills to be able to create teams that are insanely creative as a way to do the best work of their careers. So that has always been the highlight, working with a small team inside of Google Analytics, working with the Typekit team, working inside of Adobe, the Adaptive Path partners, that level of cohesion is a remarkable experience.
Yeah, I'm going to intentionally filter this next question because of your background, right? Because you have a unique background. Somebody wants to start talking to the internet, right? But they're not just me, who's random nobody, doesn't really have a big network, is just kind of starting a thing just to start a thing. But instead, there's somebody who, has been there, has been in leadership at large, medium-sized organization, and they're saying, there's a thing that I want to tell people, or there's a thing I think I can provide back to the community, but they've never talked to the internet before, right? Like they've been mainly in leadership or doing, their job of whatever nature that is. What do you tell them, right, when they're thinking about starting this process?
A lot of the advice we talked about before, in that anybody can do this and should, right? Like the people who are already doing this and considered, again, quote unquote, thought leaders are no different than anybody else. I think there's a tremendous opportunity still today to be able to share what you have learned in your profession or elsewhere. If anything, there's even more of an opportunity to that. So perhaps trying to do public speaking as an avenue, right? And working your way through those sort of ranks. Like there are organizations now in various disciplines of like, we're going to have a meetup and we only want first-time speakers, that kind of stuff to connect in your profession, in your craft. And that can be anything like sales, marketing, development, all the aspects of development, design, all of that, to find those communities where that's happening and say, can I have a shot? Can I have the stage? Can I do a 30-minute talk? Right. I think it's very accessible. I don't think it's like too late or that the internet is too crowded. I don't think any of that. I don't think any of that is true.
Okay.
And I think public speaking is a great way to start because of that. Again, that imposed deadline of I've got to organize my thoughts and be able to fill up the 30-minute time slot, and that's going to happen coming up in 6 weeks. Like I got to do it, right?
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. I think it's a wonderful way of getting started.
Alrighty, are you ready for the lightning round or the unlightning round?
Sure, you bet.
Okay, and just to remind everybody, Jeff does not know these questions. Overall, what is your favorite content on the internet?
My favorite content on the internet. Can I answer in two parts? Like,
sure.
I think the designers who are practicing and publishing the Medium, I read that every day. Like, I just think there's great stuff, and I wouldn't direct you to any specifics. Just all of the design stuff that's happening on Medium is great. Then on my off hours, man, I just love watching YouTube. It's just remarkable. Again, remember when I said like I feel like every day is an opportunity to learn more, growth mindset. Like the unbelievable amount of crazy good content for learning new things on YouTube is fantastic. I just love it.
Okay, second one. Your overall favorite personality on the internet?
My favorite personality on the internet. I think right now it's CGP Grey. He is you go listen to the Hello Internet podcast. He's fantastic. And he's also got a YouTube channel where he illustrates really interesting sort of topics in society. You should put a link in the show notes. He's really, really good.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So a creator show content that you would consider on the rise, right? So it's not necessarily like in my mind, CGP Grey is like, he's already out there.
Established.
Everybody knows. Yeah, he knows. Everybody knows about him. But what's something that's on the rise that people should check out?
I pause because there are like 15 different shows on the on the Relay FM network.
Just
frankly.
go with them. Just random.
Yeah. You're putting me on the spot here. It's been around for a while, but you could go listen to Connected or Analog. I think both of those are just so good.
Yeah.
I think like inside the little niche of like we talk about the Mac all of the time or Apple products all of the time, they would not feel like they're on the rise. They feel very established, but I think for the broader world, there's so much you can learn from them. And I think frankly the Relay Network has the opportunity to leave these smaller communities, or not leave these smaller communities, but to stand on top of them into a much more sort of almost global conversation. I think they're doing such good work.
Awesome. You're only allowed. So let's say, in a hypothetical situation, we put you in quarantine, right? You're not allowed to go anywhere. You're not allowed to do anything. But in this
Hypothetical.
in this hypothetical situation, right? We also limit your ability, and you can only listen or watch one thing on the internet. What is the one thing? And you can do like the whole season, or if they're like a weekly show, you can listen every week, right? Or watch it every week, but it's only one, entity, only one brand, if you will.
Oh, that's so hard because I feel like it's a endorsement as well, and I can only watch one thing. I'm just going to give you I'm going to give you a very personal answer. You should just watch the new Queer Eye on Netflix. Oh my God, it's so good.
Okay. All right. So there we go. All right. And then the final one. What was your favorite large company to work for?
My favorite large company to work for was probably Adobe. I mean, I've only I worked for three. I worked for Lycos, and that was terrible. I worked for Google, and that was hard. It was a struggle. Yeah. It was a remarkable work, and it was a remarkable company, but it was at a time when design was not just devalued, but often looked at with aggression. So it was really hard to be there and practice what I was practicing.
Okay,
it's a very different place now. Oh, this is the lightning round.
No, you're good. No, you're good. This last one is the open ended.
All right. Yeah.
So keep going.
But the work that we did at Adobe was just so powerful, so strong, and so transformative to a 30-year-old company that, had to completely change its business model. And the openness to the process of doing it from a UX point of view was just remarkable. And I learned so much. Oh my God, I learned so much. It was Adobe. Yep.
Fantastic. Jeff, thanks so much for being on the show. We learned a lot from you, and you gave us a really good and interesting perspective on, just tying everything together, right? Talking to the internet and the different ways that can happen. Where can people learn more about you or find more about your work?
You can see the sort of biography and all of that at about.me/Veen. That's where I kind of I have a little kind of overview, and that's got links to other things that I do. I'm at Veen, Veen, at Twitter. But like I said, I've been sort of scaled back from social media for a little while, so not a lot happening over there. But then I think where I'm putting most of the effort that we spoke about in this conversation is at Presentable, presentable.fm. As part of is the podcast. So go have a listen and let me know what you think.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Jeff. If you want to know more about this show, you can find us on Twitter at TTTI Podcast or on the internet at www.talkingtotheinternet.com. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for learning with us, and I look forward to being with you next time. Bye-bye.
This has been a Schwa Schwa production.